It was really doomed from the outset in many ways. And Diana was not the pliant, conventional daughter of an earl that one might have expected. She had an independent thought, but she was great cunning, she was very smart, she was witty and fast.
In the summer of 2013, while the world waited for Prince William and Kate Middleton's first child to be born, a genetics company quietly released a finding that had almost nothing to do with the newborn and everything to do with a woman who died more than a century and a half earlier. The claim was startling on its face. The future King of England, through his mother Diana, carried a rare strand of mitochondrial DNA traced back to a woman born in Western India around 1790. For a family whose identity had been built for generations on the idea of unbroken English and Scottish pedigree, this was not a footnote. It was a correction to the record. To understand why this mattered, it helps to understand what mitochondrial DNA actually is and why it behaves so differently from the rest of our genetic material. Most of our DNA is a shuffle, half from each parent, recombined and reshuffled every generation until any single ancestor's contribution becomes a rounding error. Mitochondrial DNA does not play by those rules. It sits in the mitochondria, the energy-producing structures inside our cells, and it passes down almost unchanged from mother to child, generation after generation, along an unbroken maternal line. Sons inherit it, but cannot pass it on. Only daughters carry it forward. That makes mitochondrial DNA a kind of genealogical fingerprint that no marriage, no adoption on the father's side, and no amount of social reinvention can alter. If you can trace an unbroken line of mothers, the mitochondrial signature at the end of that line is, in a very real sense, the signature of the woman at its start. The company that ran the tests, Britain's DNA, said it had identified two of Diana's distant maternal relatives, descendants of the same female line, and had them tested independently. Both carried the same rare haplogroup, known as R30b. According to the researchers, this particular genetic signature had at that point been documented in only a small number of people worldwide, nearly all of them from South Asia, with the closest matches concentrated in India and one in Nepal. It had not been found in native European populations. That absence is what made the results so striking. If R30b appears almost exclusively in South Asian populations, and if two independent descendants of Diana's maternal line both carry it, the simplest explanation is that a South Asian woman entered that line at some point in the past few centuries, and her signature rode down through every daughter after her, undiluted, all the way to Diana and her sons. The genealogical trail pointed to a specific person, Eliza Kawark, born around 1790 in Surat, a bustling trading port on India's western coast. Surat in that period was one of the great commercial crossroads of the region, a city thick with merchants, brokers, and agents from Persia, Armenia, Portugal, the Netherlands, and an increasingly ambitious British East India Company. It was a place where identity could be layered, where a family might present one face to a foreign trading partner and live an entirely different life at home. Eliza's own background reflected exactly that kind of layering. Her father is generally recorded as bearing an Armenian surname, and Eliza herself used Armenian script in her correspondence. In the social arithmetic of British colonial India, that detail carried enormous weight. Armenian Christians occupied a recognized, relatively respectable place in the commercial life of British India. To be described as Armenian was to be folded into a category the British found tolerable. Genealogists and biographers researching the Spencer family, including Lady Colin Campbell in her biography of Diana, have suggested that Eliza's Armenian identity was emphasized in part because the alternative description of her, as a woman of South Asian ancestry, carried a much heavier social cost in 19th century Britain. Eliza's connection to the future royal family runs through Theodore Forbes, a young Scottish merchant working for the East India Company who arrived in India in the early 1800s and was posted to Surat. Historical accounts describe Eliza and Theodore forming a long-term domestic relationship, one that produced two children, a daughter named Catherine, known as Kitty, born in 1812, and a son named Alexander. Official document from the period, including Forbes's will, describe Eliza in far cooler terms, as a housekeeper, and describe Kitty as his reputed natural daughter, language that reflects the period's careful, distancing vocabulary for relationships and children that colonial society did not want to formally recognize. Whatever the true nature of the relationship, in an era before genetic testing existed, the labels applied by wills and church registers were often the only version of events that survived. And those labels were written by people with strong incentives to describe things in the least complicated way possible. What we know for certain is that Forbes's career trajectory pulled him away from Surat and toward Bombay, where a more senior, more socially visible position awaited him. Relationships between company men and Indian women had been common in the earlier decades of British trading presence in India. But by the 1810s and 1820s, the social climate was shifting toward a much harder racial line, one that made mixed relationships increasingly incompatible with advancement in polished colonial society. Forbes died at sea in 1820. His will left Eliza a modest annuity and directed that his daughter Kitty be sent to Scotland, while his son Alexander remained in India. Kitty was raised among her father's relatives, eventually marrying into the Crombie family and becoming, by all outward appearances, a fully assimilated member of Scottish gentry society. Whatever she knew or did not know about her mother's background, the biological fact carried forward regardless. The mitochondrial line that ran through her body kept passing to her daughters and their daughters, down through 5 more generations, arriving eventually at Frances Roche, Diana's mother, and then at Diana herself. It's worth being honest about where the certainty in this account ends and where reasonable doubt begins. Eliza Kawork's precise ancestry has never been fully settled by historians. Some sources describe her as Armenian. Others, including later biographical accounts, describe her as at least partly of Indian descent. Genealogical researchers who have examined the record note plainly that her exact background remains unresolved. The mitochondrial evidence strongly supports a South Asian origin for that specific maternal line, but evidence of that kind tells us about a genetic signature, not about a fully reconstructed biography. We know the haplogroup. We do not have surviving personal letters from Eliza describing her feelings about her children being sent away, and any script that presents her private thoughts, her exact words, or her emotional interior as historical fact is dramatizing, not reporting. What can be responsibly said is narrower, and in its own way still remarkable. A rare genetic marker consistent with South Asian ancestry sits in the maternal line of the British royal family, 7 generations back from Diana, in a woman whose own identity was described inconsistently by the record keepers of her time. It's also worth noting that Britain's DNA's announcement did not arrive without controversy. Genetic genealogists at the time pointed out that the company built much of its public reputation on press releases timed to major royal news events, and some researchers in the field were openly skeptical of how confidently the company presented its conclusions. Given that full academic peer review of the specific methodology was not widely available alongside the announcement. Geneticist Brian Sykes, whose earlier popular work had helped popularize mitochondrial ancestry testing for the public, was associated with related genetic genealogy ventures, and it's fair to say his broader body of popular genetic claims has had a mixed track record. Some of his conclusions about European population history have since been revised or challenged by more advanced whole genome sequencing techniques. None of this necessarily undermines the core finding about haplogroup R30b, which rests on comparatively straightforward mitochondrial sequencing and has been corroborated by other genetic genealogists examining similar family lines. But it's a useful reminder that even genuinely interesting scientific findings can arrive wrapped in more certainty and drama than the underlying data strictly supports, especially when a company has a commercial incentive to generate headlines. What can be said with more confidence is the broader historical pattern this finding illuminates. Mixed relationships between European traders and local women were common across the era of East India Company expansion, and the children of those relationships were routinely absorbed into European family trees under carefully managed labels: reputed daughter, housekeeper, ward. Language designed to acknowledge a blood connection while denying it any real social standing. As those families climbed further into respectable society over subsequent generations, the inconvenient details of an ancestor's actual background tended to soften, get simplified, or disappear from the version of the family story told at the dinner table. Eliza Kevork's redescription, as simply Armenian, fits this pattern closely, whether it was a deliberate choice by the family or simply the version of events that survived because it was the more comfortable one to repeat. The genetic finding also carries a particular irony, given how obsessively the Spencer family's English pedigree had been documented and celebrated by genealogists over the centuries. Diana's ancestry had already been mapped in the conventional paper record, as about as purely aristocratic English and Scottish as any bloodline in Britain, complete with tangled illegitimate branches reaching back toward Stuart and even older royal lines. The idea that a South Asian woman from a port city in Gujarat sat quietly inside that same maternal line, unrecorded and unacknowledged for 2 centuries, complicates a narrative of purity that the aristocracy had built much of its self-image around. It doesn't erase the documented European ancestry. It simply adds a real, previously unacknowledged strand to it. Because mitochondrial DNA passes only through mothers, the significance of this finding has a hard biological limit. Diana passed the R30b haplogroup to both of her sons, William and Harry, making them, according to the genetic genealogists who studied the case, very likely the first documented instance of confirmed South Asian maternal ancestry this close to the British throne. But neither William nor Harry can pass that particular mitochondrial signature to their own children, since only daughters transmit it. Whatever happens next in the family tree, this specific thread, the one that began in Surat around 1790, ends with this generation. It cannot travel further down the male line, no matter how many children follow. What the finding leaves behind isn't really a piece of royal trivia so much as a small, very concrete illustration of how selectively family history gets remembered. A woman's ancestry gets softened into a more convenient version. That version gets repeated for 200 years until it hardens into accepted fact, and then a laboratory test, built on a piece of biology no social pressure could ever touch, quietly contradicts it. Eliza Kevork's full story, her relationship with Theodore Forbes, her feelings about her children, the details of her later life, remains only partially known and, in places, genuinely disputed by historians. But the mitochondrial signature she passed to her daughter Kitty is not in dispute. It traveled through 6 more generations of women who almost certainly had no idea they carried it, arrived in a princess who became one of the most photographed women of the 20th century, and now rests, permanently and without controversy, in the cells of a future king.